Our speaker today is Dr. Richard Van Dellen, a retired allergist from Mayo Clinic.
I would like to start by just reading two very familiar passages from Scripture for you. First is from Luke, chapter 10, starting with the 25th verse. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And then, of course, followed the Good Samaritan story, which you're all quite familiar with. But I think in this day and age, it's a good question for all of us as to who the Samaritan in that parable would be if it were told today. It's my understanding that Samaritan was somebody that the Jews hated. So I think we should think about who that would be for us today. And then from Matthew 5, starting with the 43rd verse, again, very familiar passage. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Love your enemies. Who would that be in this day and age for us? And how then do we love them? Are we going to love ISIS and the people that do the kind of horrible things that ISIS has gotten publicity for? Is this practical? I think those are questions that we should struggle with, and I hope to show you that maybe it is practical. Gandhi believed it. Just two quotes from him. "Just as a scientist will work wonders out of various applications of the law of nature, even so a man who applies the law of love with scientific precision can work greater wonders." Second quote, "Nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. By it alone can mankind be saved." The question is, do we as Christians really believe that there's any efficacy in loving our neighbors? I would like to suggest that there is a practical application of love that is helpful. And I'd like to start by talking about Erica Chenoweth, who wrote this book. We were privileged to hear her speak last fall at the College of St. Benedict Peace Forum. She was a skeptic, like I and many of you might be. She was doing studies on terrorism for a postdoctoral degree, and she did not believe that there was any way that nonviolence could have any effect on terrorists. She was met at a meeting, the co-author of this book. This is the results of her study, just briefly. They looked at 323 campaigns since 1900 And the criteria for inclusion was that they would bring about regime change or acquire additional territory for a country. So these were pretty strict requirements. That would mean that the civil rights movement in this country, for example, was not included in her study. And what she found, she said, just blew her away. The nonviolent campaigns were successful 52% of the time, and the violent campaigns were only successful half that, 26%. The top number should be 53, by the way. So this convinced her that nonviolence had some efficacy and was actually better than violence. Well, what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is talk to you about four things. The gospel, in one word, is love. Love thy neighbor as thyself. I've already mentioned that and talked to you about that. If we have time at the end, we'll sing a song about it. Second point is that we are acculturated to the idea that violence and war will save us. The opposite, however, I believe is true, that militarism and violence threatens our very existence as a civilization. And then lastly, that a practical application of this love is active nonviolence. And I'll weave some of that into the talk and then end with two examples. And I got hooked on an old black and white Western. And Clint Eastwood was the star. His wife was killed, and he set about taking the law into his own hands. There were 4 suspect bandito killers, and he went about getting them one by one, killing them, and the sheriff and the posse was either a few hours or a day behind. He killed all 4 of them. He then found out that they were actually innocent, and then they found the real killer, but that didn't really make any difference. He was given a hero's welcome and a beautiful woman in addition in the western town at the end of the movie. This theme is everywhere. Just look for it. It's in kid movies, it's in Disney movies, it's just everywhere present. Now, to put this in theological language, since this is a Christian church, theologian Walter Wake said, we believe in the myth of redemptive violence. He considered that a false belief, myth used in that term, and that violence would save us. Glenn Ford, who writes a blog for the Black Agenda Report, put it this way, that the U.S. sees no salvation except through global war. I'd like to just say a little bit more about that. And I'd like to go to the opening of the Notre Dame football season last September. They had a pre-game program where the marching band was on the field and played some patriotic music and songs. And then a plane flew over and 4 Navy SEALs parachuted or jumped out of the plane and parachuted down to the field. And the PA announcer, while they were slowly descending, said, the talked about the virtues of the Navy and its role as a global force for good. The PA also noted that the SEALs are among the finest warriors in the world and that they are trained to parachute deep behind enemy lines under cover of darkness. As the jumpers came into the stadium, one of them displayed a large American flag. The crowd erupted in applause. Well, let's go forward just 3 months to December 6, 2014, where 36 of these Navy SEALs, I don't know if they were all Navy SEALs, they were part of the Special Operations Command. They dropped in by helicopter, they didn't parachute, in the middle of the night in Yemen, attempting to rescue Luke Summers, an American journalist kept hostage, along with Pierre Corky, a South African teacher who was also a hostage of Al-Qaeda. Corky, by the way, was due to be released the next day. The first attempt to rescue Summers a month earlier had failed. This attempt, they ran into gunfire. The end result, Summers and Corky were mortally wounded and 8 civilians were killed. They were able to transport Summers and Corky into the helicopter, but they died within a few hours. Now, these were representatives of the SOCOM, Special Operations Command, and I suspect some of you might not even know about this, but they operated last year in 133 countries. You can keep that in mind because I'll say a word about that later. Another Navy SEAL was Chris Kyle. You all know him as the American Sniper. The book is still on the bestseller list, paperback. I'd like to just quote from the book, Savage, Despicable Evil. That's what we were fighting in Iraq. That's why a lot of people, including myself, called the enemy savages. I only wish I had killed more. End of quote. He had a tattoo of a crusader on his arm. Another quote, I wanted everyone to know I was a Christian. I had put it in red, blood red. I hated the savages I'd been fighting. I always will. End of quote. I think you all know that he was murdered, and the trial of his murder is going on. The movie, The American Sniper, was released on Christmas Day, which I find an irony, and it grossed over $105 million over the Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday weekend. I'd like to say a word about drones also, but you know, I forgot something, and that is that I was going to give you a quiz at the beginning of this, and I just remembered. So I'm going to go back and do the quiz. I just want to name some people and dates, and all you have to do is raise your hand. You don't have to be bashful. Raise your hand if you know who these people are, and if you can, you know, say 1 or 2 sentences about them. The first couple, one is Jeanette Rankin. Second, George Patton. Then the dates, 9/11/2001. Everybody knows that. 9/11/1973. 9/11/1906. Douglas MacArthur. Frank Kellogg. Now, you need to know more than that Kellogg Middle School was named after him. That doesn't qualify. You got to know why Kellogg Middle School was named after him. David Petraeus, Mal Duncan, David Hartsoff, and Nonviolent Peace Force. Chris Kyle, we already talked about. Kathy Kelly of the Voices for Creative Nonviolence. That's the last one. I'll come back to those in a few minutes. Now, I want to say a word about drones. There was a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee that heard an afternoon of testimony on our drone program. I happened to be in Washington at the time, Washington, D.C., and one of the people that I was with attended this subcommittee. Senator Al Franken was a part of this subcommittee, and he attended some, but not all of the testimony. 4 people testified at this, and one of them was a young man from Yemen who gave very emotional testimony about the effect of these drones on his country, which was that people were afraid, that people had started to dislike the United States, which was new in his country, and that the drones and their attacks in Yemen was a recruiting ground for Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. But Rosa Brooks also testified. Rosa Brooks is a lawyer at Georgetown University, teaches law there. She's was formerly employed by the Pentagon, and her husband is a lieutenant colonel, career military person. So she's not really a peacenik like I am. This is what she said. I think what it comes down to, senators, is that right now we have an executive branch making a claim it has the right to kill anyone, anywhere on earth, at any time, for secret reasons, based on secret evidence, in a secret process undertaken by unidentified officials. That frightens me. I don't doubt their good faith, but that's not the rule of law. I would suggest that it violates more than just the rule of law, at least in my view. None of you knew who Kathy Kelly was, so here she is. And I show her after the part about drones. Kathy Kelly is a co-coordinator of the Voices for a Creative, the Center for Creative Nonviolence. She has spent a good deal of time in Afghanistan and Iraq. She chose to be in Iraq at the start of the war and the shock and awe bombing campaign in 2003. She's been in Afghanistan many times and experienced the drone attacks in Afghanistan. So she's currently in federal prison in Lexington because she protested the drone attacks. What she did was she tried to deliver a letter and a loaf of bread to the commander of the Whitfield Air Force Base in Missouri, which is a center or an Air Force base that has the joysticks that controls the drones. She was not allowed in. She tried to go in anyway. She was arrested. And at her trial, the prosecutor said that she needed to be rehabilitated. And she was given a 3-month sentence for this action. Now, Kathy Kelly has also been associated with the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. Oops. And here's a picture, and this is why I'm wearing this blue scarf. These intrepid young people have started a program in Afghanistan to protest the war, and they're doing other things that I'll tell you about in a minute, but they have adopted these blue scarves. Their sky blue color, indicating in their view that the same blue sky is over all of us, and we have a connection with people all over the earth. This is a picture of them in one of their marches. The citizens of Afghanistan say no to war. Besides education and these kind of protests, they do several other things, and I'll just mention 2 of them. One of them is the DUBAT project. It's a very interesting project where they hire and pay women to sew blankets and stuff them with wool. And here's a picture of some of the end product. The blankets that these women made. These are women from 3 different tribal or ethnic groups that worked together, and they were basically jobless beforehand, and they make these wool blankets. And here's a picture of them loaded onto a truck to be delivered and given free to people. This is in Kabul, away from Kabul, people who do not have adequate warmth for the hard winters that they have. And you can't see very well, but that's snow on the ground underneath the truck. Another project that they have is they've started recently a school for street kids in Kabul. There's estimated 60,000 street kids running around Kabul, and they've started a school for these street kids. So it's very heartwarming to hear, for me anyway, to hear these kind of stories. I would like to just say a word about the causes of terrorism. At the White House press conference after this Jordanian physician killed 6 CIA operatives on December 30, 2009, Helen Thomas, I don't know if you know Helen Thomas, but she was at every presidential White House press conference. She always sat in the front row. Everybody knew her name, or all the presidents knew her name. She, a feisty woman who asked hard questions, and she was 89 years at the time of this press conference. She asked, why do they harm us? What is their motivation? We never hear you say why. She got no answer at this press conference. What do we know about the answers? Well, I'd like to just show you 2 things that we know about the answers. This is a report from the U.S. Defense Science Board. This is a board of the Pentagon that gives, I think, monthly reports and studies things that the Pentagon asks them to study. And in their September 2004 report, happened to be on page 40 of the report actually, so it was a long report, but they said the following: Muslims do not hate our freedom, but rather they hate our policies. The overwhelming majority voice their objections to what they see as one-sided support of Israel against Palestinian rights, and the long-standing support for what Muslims collectively see as tyrannies, most notably Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Pakistan, and the Gulf states. I don't know if you know, but last week Saudi Arabia beheaded publicly a woman who was dragged screaming to her execution site, screaming, "I did not kill," all the way. This is a report from the Pentagon's own study group. Then I'd mentioned two books dealing with suicide terrorism. Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism by Robert Pape was written in 2006. He studied 315 suicide bombings and concluded that they were rarely motivated by religion but by politics, the main motivation being foreign troops on home soil. His second book, Cutting the Fuse, The Explosion of Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It, was authored by him and a co-author, Jason Feldman, published in October of 2010. I've not read these books. This is just what I've read, reviews of them and articles. But by the time of the second book, the number of suicide terrorist attacks had risen to 2,100. And a quote from the book: "The principal cause of suicide terrorism is resistance to foreign occupation, not Islamic fundamentalism." And I'll just remind you what I've already told you before, that Special Operations Command, that's our troops, they operated in 130 plus countries last year. So if we're worried about troops on foreign soil, we have a lot of them. We have military bases in over 130 countries. A lot of them are small bases, but there's some very large bases. I just learned, for example, that we have a huge base in Kosovo, Air Force Base, which I didn't know about. So we have them all over the place.